The bread was already in the oven when executive pastry chef Gareth Oland walked in. He didn't say good morning. He never did. Not to the dishwashers, not to the prep staff, not to anyone whose name he couldn't remember on command. He walked the length of the kitchen the way a man walks through a parking lot, purposeful, unseeing, looking past everything that didn't concern him directly. What concerned him that morning was the smell. It stopped him 3 feet from the pastry station. A warm, yeasty pull in the air. Something deeper than the standard brioche they ran on weekdays. Something with ferment and age and weight, underneath the sweetness. He turned slowly. At the far end of the prep counter, tucked into the corner where the floor drain gurgled and the overhead light flickered, twice an hour, stood Milo Deschamps, 23 years old, officially employed as a dishwasher and general kitchen utility at Pastry, one of Charleston's most decorated fine dining restaurants. 2 James Beard nominations on the wall, a guest list that included senators and a former Secretary of State. Milo had worked there for 8 months. In that time, he had cleaned approximately 40,000 dishes, swept the walk-in cooler floor on 6 separate occasions, after someone knocked over a shelf of stock, and been called by his correct name exactly once. He was not supposed to be near the ovens. He was not supposed to be baking anything. He had come in 40 minutes early, on his own time, unpaid, and used the tail end of the bakery's overnight proof window to slide a single loaf into the lower oven before anyone arrived. He hadn't asked. He knew better than to ask. He'd been watching Gareth and the pastry team for 8 months, studying every movement from his position at the sink, the way other people watch television, passively from the outside but absorbing more than they'd admit. Gareth crossed the kitchen in 11 steps. "What?" he said, and his voice had that particular flatness that meant he was deciding something, "is in my oven." Milo turned. He had a lean face, the kind that showed everything. Nerves, steadiness, all of it visible at once. He didn't flinch. That was the thing people who underestimated Milo never anticipated. He never flinched. "A loaf," he said, sorta. "I used the discard from the house starter. It was going to be thrown out anyway. I can take it out now if you want." Gareth stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the oven, then back at Milo. "You used my starter, the discard, the portion you were going to dump. I know what discard means." Gareth's jaw shifted. "You're the dishwasher." "Yes, sir, the dishwasher," Gareth repeated, as if saying it a second time would clarify something for one of them. "Decided to use my kitchen, my equipment, my ingredients, without asking. I came in early, before service. I didn't touch anything that was in use. That is not the point." Gareth's voice rose just enough. Around the kitchen, the prep staff who had begun trickling in stopped what they were doing. Nobody moved. This was a known phenomenon at Pastry. When Gareth's voice changed register, the room went still by instinct, the way animals go quiet before weather. "The point is that you are here to wash dishes. You are not here to bake. You are not a baker. You are not a chef. You are not anything in this kitchen except the person who cleans up after the people who are." "Do you understand that?" Milo said nothing. "Take it out," Gareth said. "Throw it away. And if you ever touch anything in this kitchen that isn't a plate or a pot again, you're done. Are we clear?" Milo opened the oven. The loaf was golden, a deep, burnished amber across the crown, the score marks he'd made with a razor blade opening into those jagged, beautiful rifts that good sourdough makes when the steam hits right. The smell that came out with it was extraordinary. Several of the prep cooks looked up involuntarily. Gareth didn't look at the bread. He was already walking away. Milo set the loaf on the counter. He stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then he wrapped it in a dish towel, carried it to the back, and set it in his bag. He washed dishes for the next 9 hours without saying another word about it. There are things you learn about a person in 8 months of watching them work. Milo had learned that Gareth Oland was technically brilliant. Genuinely, undeniably so. His laminated doughs were flawless. His tempering was machine precise. He had a palate that could identify a single off note in a ganache, the way a musician catches a bad interval. At 38, he had earned everything on the wall of that kitchen, and he had earned it through a combination of obsessive skill and a near-total absence of mercy for anything he considered mediocre. The problem was that Gareth had stopped being able to tell the difference between mediocre and unfamiliar. At some point, Milo couldn't say when and suspected Gareth couldn't either. The two things had fused together in his mind. Anything outside his own practice was suspect. Anything from outside his own world was probably inferior. He wasn't cruel in the way of sadists. He was cruel in the way of people who have decided the circle of worthwhile things is small and have placed themselves at its center, and genuinely cannot understand why anyone would argue with that arrangement. Milo had grown up in Gullah Geechee country, on the South Carolina coast, in a family where cooking was vocabulary. His grandmother, Opaline, had kept a kitchen the size of a closet and produced things from it that people drove 40 minutes for. Red rice, okra soup, Ben wafers that shattered into something between a cookie and a prayer, and bread, always bread, a sourdough she'd maintained from a starter that predated Milo by decades, fed on local flour and coastal air and whatever instinct she'd inherited from the women before her. She had never written a recipe down in her life. She said recipes were for people who didn't trust themselves to remember what mattered. Everything she knew she carried in her hands. When Opaline died, Milo was 19. She left him 3 things. A cast-iron skillet so seasoned it was nearly black, a notebook with no writing in it, and a small jar of starter that had to be fed every day or it would die. He fed it every day. He had never once missed. He'd moved to Charleston at 22, chasing the culinary world the only way he could. From the bottom, without a degree, without connections, without anything except what his grandmother's hands had put into his. Dishwashing was the entry point. He'd known that going in. He'd also known or believed that if he kept showing up and kept his eyes open, something would shift eventually. What he hadn't fully accounted for was Gareth Oland. After the bread incident, things changed in the specific way things change when someone with power decides you've become inconvenient. Gareth didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. He simply began to notice Milo, which sounds like the opposite of a punishment, but wasn't. Being noticed by Gareth meant that your smallest misstep was logged and remarked upon. A dish returned with a spot on it, a pot not dried before storage, a moment's pause in the dish rotation that slowed the line by 40 seconds. Each of these was mentioned in Gareth's quiet, flat voice, in front of whoever happened to be nearby. The rest of the kitchen staff mostly looked away. A few of them, the ones who'd been there long enough to have their own histories with Gareth, gave Milo small gestures of solidarity. A nod, an extra 5 minutes on a break, a prep cook named Sandra, who started leaving a covered plate for him near the end of service, without ever commenting on it. Milo stayed. He kept coming in. He kept watching. He also kept baking, just not there. The apartment Milo rented was 12 minutes from the restaurant by bike, on the second floor of a house whose landlord was under the impression that vintage fixtures was a selling point rather than a warning. The kitchen had one working burner, a temperamental oven that ran 15 degrees hot and almost no counter space. He had solved the counter problem with a piece of marine plywood cut to fit over the sink. He baked on his days off. He baked on mornings before early shifts, setting his alarm for 4 so the loaves could proof while he slept another hour. He'd been doing this for years, through high school jobs, through a stint at a grocery warehouse, through a brief, dismal attempt at community college that ended when he couldn't afford the second semester. The baking was the one thing that had never stopped, because the starter his grandmother had left him required it. And because somewhere in the ritual of it, the measuring, the waiting, the strange animal patience of watching dough transform, he found the only version of himself that felt completely clear. He started giving the bread away, to the landlord, to the woman downstairs who worked night shifts, to a neighbor kid who knocked on his door one afternoon because she could smell it from the hall. Word moved the way word moves in neighborhoods where people actually know each other, slowly at first, then all at once. A woman named Petra, who ran a small catering operation out of her church kitchen, tasted one of his loaves and asked if he could supply her for an event. He said yes. She paid him fairly. She told her friend Juno, who ran a farmer's market stall on Saturdays and had been looking for a local baker. Milo started showing up at the market with 2 crates of bread. He sold out by 10 every Saturday. He didn't tell anyone at Patrice. This was not exactly a secret. He wasn't hiding it, but it existed in a completely separate compartment of his life, the way his grandmother's kitchen and the wider world had always existed for him, in separate compartments. One was where he was himself. The other was where he was trying to become something officially recognized as real. What he was making was not complicated. By the standards of the place he worked, no lamination, no praline, no multi-component plated dessert with 3 textures and a tool that could only be made during a 40-minute window on a dry day. What he was making was bread, his grandmother's bread, adjusted and expanded through 4 years of his own study, with a starter that had been alive for longer than he'd been on Earth, that carried in it some combination of the low-country coast and Opaline's hands, and whatever it is that stays in living things when the people who made them are gone. He kept a notebook now. He'd bought one to replace the empty one she'd left him, and he filled it with observations the way she'd never needed to. Temperatures, hydration percentages, timing, the particular way the dough felt at different stages of proof. He was building a record of something that had never been recorded. He thought about this sometimes, about how much knowledge disappears simply because the people who hold it don't write it down, about how many recipes die with grandmothers, about what it means to be the one who decides to catch it before it falls. The call came on a Tuesday, which was Milo's day off. It was from Juno at the farmer's market, and she was talking fast, a food writer named Clifton Ware, who had a column in the Charleston Alt Weekly and a newsletter with somewhere in the range of 40,000 subscribers, had stopped by her stall the previous Saturday, tried Milo's bread, and spent 20 minutes asking Juno questions she couldn't answer. He wanted to know who made it, where the starter came from, whether the baker had a restaurant or a shop or any kind of public presence at all. Juno had given him Milo's number. Clifton Ware called that afternoon. He had the voice of someone who had eaten a great deal of food in his life and had stopped being impressed by most of it, which made him sound slightly skeptical of everything. He asked Milo if he could visit, not to interview him formally, just to watch him bake to understand the process. Milo said yes. Clifton came the following Saturday morning. He arrived at 5:30, which Milo had specified because that was when the bread needed attention, and he stood in the small kitchen with a coffee he'd brought himself and watched without saying much for 2 hours. At the end of it, he tasted a slice of the finished loaf with nothing on it, and stood there, chewing slowly, with an expression Milo couldn't fully read. "Where did you say you work?" Clifton asked. Milo told him. Clifton nodded, looking at the bread. "And they know you do this. The head pastry chef told me to stay away from the ovens." Clifton was quiet for a moment. "Of course he did," he said, and something in his tone was sad and unsurprised in equal measure. The piece came out 3 weeks later. It ran in the Wednesday print edition and went up online at the same time. And by Thursday morning it had been shared widely enough that Juno texted Milo a screenshot of someone posting about it in a food group with 40,000 members. Clifton had written it simply. No flourishes, no hyperbole, just a careful description of the bread, the starter, the grandmother, the coastal tradition it came from, and the fact that the man who made it spent his working hours washing dishes at one of the city's most celebrated fine dining establishments. He hadn't named Gareth. He hadn't needed to. Gareth read it on his phone while sitting in his car in the Patrice parking lot 20 minutes before his shift started. He read it twice. Then he sat there for a while. He was not, at his core, a stupid man. He understood immediately what the piece was, what it implied, what the reasonable outside reader would conclude about the dynamics it described without ever spelling them out. He understood that his name not being in it was a journalistic courtesy that had its own kind of indictment built into the omission. What he felt, sitting in that car, was something he would have been unable to name accurately if pressed. He might have said anger. He might have said that it was none of his business what a dishwasher did on his own time. He might have said the piece was overwritten, which was a reach, but not impossible. What he actually felt underneath all of that was something closer to the specific nausea of a man who has said something in a room he thought was empty and turned to find it wasn't. He went inside. He ran service. He said nothing to Milo. For a week, nothing happened. Then the phone calls started coming in. A restaurant group in Colombia wanted to know if Milo was available for a consulting arrangement. A boutique hotel that was opening a bakery component wanted to talk. A woman who owned 3 coffee shops in Charleston's Upper Peninsula called Juno, looking for contact information, offering to carry his bread as a weekly feature. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived for Milo at Juno's stall. She was the only address anyone had for him, from the James Beard Foundation, informing him that he had been nominated in the Emerging Baker category for their regional recognition program, submitted by a committee member who had read Clifton Ware's piece and subsequently visited the farmer's market to purchase bread in person. Juno photographed the letter and sent it to him without comment. He stood in his kitchen and read it on his phone, and then set the phone down on the plywood counter and stood there for a long time looking out the window at the street below. He called his mother, who cried. He called his aunt, who wanted to call every person she knew immediately. He stood in the kitchen after he hung up and fed the starter, the way he did every day, the way he had done every day since he was 19, and thought about Opaline. He thought about all the things she'd known that she hadn't known she knew. He thought about the notebook she'd left him, the one she'd kept empty, and how strange that had seemed to him at first, to leave someone a blank book. He understood it now. She'd left him room to write his own. He gave his notice at Patrice the following Monday. He did it the way he did everything, directly, without drama, in writing, hand-delivered to management. He worked out his 2 weeks because that was the right thing to do, and because Milo Deschamps the kind of person who left things unfinished just because they'd become unpleasant. Gareth was in the kitchen when Milo came in for his second-to-last shift. They had not spoken, not really, since the bread incident months earlier, not in any way that counted as a conversation. The kitchen ran the same way it always had. Milo washed dishes, the pastry team laminated and tempered and piped, service went on. But that afternoon, during the lull between lunch and dinner prep, Gareth walked to the dish station. He stood there for a moment. Milo kept working. "I heard," Gareth said finally, "about the foundation thing." Milo didn't stop what he was doing. "Okay, I'm not." Gareth paused. Something was working its way through him, visibly, the way things work through people who are not practiced at saying them. "The bread that morning, I didn't taste it." Milo looked up. "I should have," Gareth said. "Before I said anything. I should have tasted it first." It was not an apology, exactly. Gareth was not built for exact apologies, but it was the closest thing to one that his particular architecture allowed, and Milo recognized it as such, which required a kind of generosity that Gareth had not earned but that Milo chose to offer anyway, not for Gareth's sake, but because holding the alternative was heavier than it was worth. "It was a good loaf," Milo said simply. Gareth nodded once. He went back to the pastry station. That was all. The bakery opened 14 months after Milo left Patrice. He called it Opaline's, which surprised people who expected something more modern, something that signaled its own seriousness through abstraction. But Milo had never been interested in abstraction. He was interested in the specific flour, specific salt, specific water temperature, specific tradition with a specific history attached to a specific woman who had made it in a specific kitchen on a coast that had held his family for generations. The space was small, a former dry goods storefront on a block that still had a tire shop on one end and a woman who sold church hats out of her living room on the other. He whitewashed the brick. He put the original cast-iron skillet his grandmother had left him on a shelf behind the counter, not for sale, not for display in any precious sense, just there. The way things are there in houses that are actually lived in. The starter lived on the counter in a wide-mouthed jar. He fed it every morning before anything else. The first Saturday they opened, the line was around the block before 8. Clifton Ware came and stood in it like everyone else, which Milo noticed and did not remark on. A woman from the Post and Courier was there. 2 culinary students from Johnson & Wales stood in line with their phones out. Juno came with flowers. The bread sold out in under 2 hours. Milo stood at the counter and sold every loaf himself because he wanted to be the person handing it to people. Not for the symbolism of it, but because he'd learned from his grandmother that this was part of the transaction, the handing over. The moment of contact. It was the difference between food as product and food as something else, something that didn't have a clean name, but that everyone recognized when they received it. The James Beard recognition came that spring, not the full award, but the regional honor, which came with a ceremony in Atlanta and a small grant and, more importantly, a kind of institutional legibility that changed who could see him. Doors open that don't open for everyone. He walked through them, without pretending they shouldn't have been open all along. He started an apprenticeship program the following year. 2 positions paid, specifically recruiting people without formal culinary credentials, young people from neighborhoods like the one he'd grown up in. People who already knew things that nobody had thought to ask them about. He interviewed them himself, and the one question he always asked was, "Who taught you to cook?" He was looking for people who had an answer that mattered to them. He was looking for people who were keeping something alive. The program's first graduate was a 20-year-old named Corinna who had grown up in the Sea Islands and whose great-uncle had kept a rice field into the 1980s. She knew 5 preparations for red rice that nobody else in that kitchen had ever heard of. She started writing them down, and Milo gave her a notebook for it, a good one, the kind that lasts. When she asked him once why he hadn't fought harder, back then, when Gareth threw him out of the kitchen, why he hadn't argued, hadn't complained to management, hadn't done any of the things that people suggested when they heard that part of the story, Milo thought about it for a while before he answered. Because what I had wasn't going to be proven by an argument, he said. It was going to be proven by bread. Corinna wrote that down too. There is something that gets lost when the people who carry knowledge are told they have nothing worth carrying. It doesn't disappear. Knowledge doesn't disappear that easily, but it goes underground. It travels quietly, through back routes, handed from person to person, in kitchens that aren't on any map, in recipes that exist only as muscle memory, in starters that have to be fed every day or they die. Milo Deschamps had been carrying something. For years he had carried it in a jar and in his hands and in the empty notebook his grandmother left him, and nobody in an official kitchen had told him it was worth anything he hadn't needed them to. That's the part that gets missed sometimes, in stories like this one. The assumption that the validation was the point, that what mattered was finally being seen by the right people. But Milo had known what he had before Clifton Ware tasted it. He'd known when he was 19 years old, standing in Opaline's closet kitchen watching her work. He'd known every morning for years when he woke up early to tend to something that had been alive longer than he had. The recognition was not the arrival. The recognition was just other people catching up. And the loaf that Gareth Oland told him to throw away, that cold morning before service at Patrice, Milo had taken it home. He'd eaten half of it for dinner that night, standing at his sink. The other half he'd saved, and the next morning he'd made bread pudding with it, which had been, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. He'd eaten it alone, with a cup of coffee, before the sun came up. It was enough. It had always been enough. The rest of it, the award, the bakery, the line around the block, that was real and it mattered, and he was grateful for every piece of it. But the morning had been enough on its own, and he had known it while he was in it, and that was the thing his grandmother had actually left him. Not just the starter, not just the skillet, not just the empty notebook waiting to be filled. She had left him the ability to know what something was worth before the world got around to agreeing with him. That is rarer than any recipe, and it cannot be thrown away.